A Palestinian-led campaign against Israel. It's called Boycott, Divestment, Sanctions, or BDS. Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. The Palestinian-led movement called Boycott, Divestment, Sanctions, better known as BDS, is making news again. The global campaign, which seeks to put economic and political pressure on Israel over its treatment of Palestinians, has been around for more than a decade. Its goals include ending Israeli occupation of the West Bank. But BDS has also been denounced by Israeli leaders and their supporters as being anti-Semitic, a charge it denies. And last week, that debate played out on Capitol Hill, with the United States House of Representatives passing a resolution condemning the movement. In a few minutes, we will get an Israeli perspective on this controversial issue, but we begin with the co-founder of BDS, Omar Barghouti, who joins us from Ramallah. Omar, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
You are a co-founder of the BDS movement. What are you hoping it will achieve? What are the movement's goals?
We're hoping that BDS, as a non-violent human rights movement that adheres to international law, would achieve Palestinian rights under international law, namely ending the 1967 occupation of Gaza and the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, ending Israel's denial of the Palestinian refugees' right, including their right to return and reparations, and full equality for Palestinian citizens of Israel. Palestinians are living not just under military occupation, not just under a system of colonization, but under a system of apartheid. So BDS aims to end this oppression so that Palestinians can enjoy freedom, justice, and equality.
You know, you say a system of apartheid. That's a word, of course, that came out of South Africa, where the black majority was discriminated against. How are Palestinians being discriminated against?
Apartheid did indeed come out of South Africa, but it became a universal crime as defined by the United Nations in international conventions. It basically means a system of hegemonic racial discrimination by one racial group against another. Palestinians who are citizens of present-day Israel suffer under a system of more than 60 racist laws that discriminate against them in all fields of life. This was entrenched with a so-called Jewish nation-state law that basically announced that Israel is only for the Jewish people and only Jews can exercise self-determination. Palestinians have no place in that existence. Palestinians in the occupied Gaza and the West Bank are also suffering from a system of apartheid, where Jewish settlers enjoy full rights, Israeli rights, whereas Palestinians who are non-citizens of Israel are denied basic rights, including freedom of movement, access to healthcare, education is hampered by hundreds of military checkpoints, not to mention Palestinian refugees who are also denied their basic UN-stipulated rights because of their identity.
Now, of course, the Israeli government and those who oppose this movement, the BDS movement, they see it very differently. They see the point of this movement is to eliminate the state of Israel. What's your response to that?
BDS aims to end injustice and inequality and denial of human rights. If those define the pillars of Israel's existence, that's the only way you can understand a human rights movement that's nonviolent, that aims towards implementing international law as leading to ending any state. There's no way this movement can be interpreted as ending the existence of anything except a system of apartheid and injustice.
Now, the BDS movement has also been described as being anti-Semitic. In fact, the Israeli Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, he dismissed it as a global campaign to delegitimize the state of Israel. These are serious charges, to which you would say what?
Well, the Israeli far-right government is the last that's qualified to say what's anti-Semitic and what's not when it's in bed with the world's anti-Semites, from Washington to Bolsonaro, to Orban, to Salvini in Italy. The fascists of the world and the anti-Semites of the world are Israel's best friends today. The second point is that BDS has been categorically opposed to all forms of racism, including anti-Semitism. This is a matter of principle that we take pride in, and that's why Jewish support for BDS, especially Jewish millennial support for BDS, has skyrocketed in the last few years. Israel is extremely worried about this phenomenon, and that's why it's trying to smear BDS in this way.
Last week, the United States House of Representatives passed a resolution which condemns the BDS movement. We had a similar resolution that was passed by the German parliament. Why hasn't the movement got any kind of international traction?
The movement had a lot of traction, and that's precisely why Congress and the German Bundestag are so worried about it. Because under Israeli pressure and under Israel lobby pressure, they're trying their best to demonize the movement and to suppress its growth. Indeed, it has grown among mainline churches in the United States, very large trade unions in India, the UK, Ireland, Canada, South Africa, and elsewhere, as well as among thousands of academics and artists and student groups around the world. So because the movement is beginning to have an economic impact, even with major pension funds pulling their investments from Israeli banks or international companies involved in Israel's human rights violations, this is precisely the traction that Israel dreads. And that's why it's pushing for a redefinition of anti-Semitism to include criticism of Israel, calling Israel apartheid, and to whitewash its own involvement with the far right around the world.
What is your view of the Trump administration's response to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict? Does it give the BDS movement a bit more impetus?
The Trump administration, being as xenophobic and racist as it is entirely partnering in Israel's crimes against the Palestinians. I can say that it's one of the most anti-Palestinian administrations in U.S. history, but it will go down in history not just as that, but as an administration that's alienating all progressives, all liberals around the world. This is why justice movements, from the climate justice to gender justice to racial justice, indigenous justice, are all uniting, and BDS is increasingly becoming part of that anti-fascist wave, this progressive wave around the world, including in the United States.
Has the movement had any significant successes so far?
Yes, I've mentioned a few, but I can reiterate some of the largest pension funds in the world, including the Norwegian Pension Fund, a Dutch pension fund, major church funds in the United States, like the United Methodist Church, the Presbyterian Church, have already divested from Israeli banks or international companies like HP, Caterpillar, Motorola Solutions, and others that are involved in Israel's crimes against the Palestinian people. That's a success for the Palestinian solidarity movement around the world. That's a success for the logic of pressure to end Israel's violations. As well, we've seen in the United States major academic associations, as well as tens of student governments around the U.S. Adopting BDS measures, from divestment to a full boycott and so on. So this is indeed gaining a lot of traction. We've seen thousands of artists join the movement, with many of the famous artists refusing to play Tel Aviv because they see it today as Sun City was in apartheid South Africa.
You know, that is one of the components, of course, of BDS, this cultural boycott. But what do you hope to achieve with the cultural boycott? Because on the one hand, you've got the economic boycott, the trade boycott, but now the cultural boycott, that would prevent people from talking to each other. And if you want to achieve some kind of settlement, some kind of agreement, surely people should be talking to each other, and doing it culturally is one of the ways of getting through that.
Of course, but there's a misunderstanding in the premise of the question. BDS does not call for cutting dialogue or communication. It simply calls for cutting complicity. It calls for doing no harm. So we ask British artists, American artists, French, South African, Brazilian artists, Indian artists to stop being involved, to stop their engagement with Israeli cultural institutions that are part and parcel of the system of occupation and apartheid. We're asking them not to agree to perform in events sponsored by Israeli embassies or the Israeli lobby, for example. That's very different than communication. There's nothing in BDS that prevents an Israeli artist, an Israeli academic from traveling, communicating with the world, publishing, performing, doing whatever, as long as it's done without institutional complicity of the State of Israel or institutions that are part of its system of apartheid.
Okay, sir, we have to leave it there. Omar Barghouti, thanks for joining us. And now for an Israeli perspective, joining us from Jerusalem is Daniel Pomerantz. He's an attorney and the executive director of Honest Reporting. Daniel, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Aaron.
Well, you've been listening there to the interview with Omar Barghouti, who's one of the co-founders of the BDS movement. He says that the point of the movement is to end the occupation of the West Bank, to end the blockade of Gaza, to go back to the 1967 boundaries. What is your response to that?
Well, my response is really not relevant. I think what's important is Mr. Barghouti's response. In 2013, he said in a lecture, and I quote, "Definitely, most definitely, we oppose a Jewish state in any part of Palestine." The purpose of the BDS movement is to put an end to the Jewish state of Israel in any borders whatsoever. It's a destructive movement. And what's most disturbing is that the movement misleads young people who really do care about social justice, and so they don't know that they're being misled and lied and led into a campaign that really is destructive and, at least philosophically, quite violent.
What about his points that Israel needs to end the occupation, end the blockade, and move back to the 67 boundaries?
Well, again, his point is not that Israel should move to the 67 boundaries. He's saying that to you right now. But he has said repeatedly that he's opposed to a Jewish state. And at UCLA in 2016, he said that he opposes a two-state solution. He also said that any Palestinians who favor coexistence are what he calls collaborators, and compared them to Nazis, and also that they are what he calls sellout Palestinians. My question is, who's standing up for those Palestinians? Who's standing up for the Palestinians who do believe in coexistence and in a two-state solution, which is something that the consensus opinion in Israel passionately believes in and works very hard toward? It's not always easy. We have to balance legitimate security concerns against a very deep desire for Israel to be independent of Palestinians and for Palestinians to have their own independence. And like any other modern Western liberal democracy, we struggle hard with these questions and try to make them work out. But Israel is the only country in the world that is singled out for not just demonization and criticism, but an attempt at total annihilation.
You know, the BDS campaign is modeled to a large extent after the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa. It's also been inspired to some extent by the civil rights movement here in the United States. Don't Palestinians have a right to seek international support for their BDS movement?
Well, certainly anybody who suffers from apartheid, for example, not being able to study in the same schools, drink from the same drinking fountains, or have the same jobs, should certainly get all the support they can in the world. Mr. Barghouti was born in Qatar, he was raised in Egypt, and he got his degree at the University of Tel Aviv, where he studied together with Christians and Jews and Arabs, all experiencing equal rights and equal opportunity in a country where Arabs serve as Supreme Court justices, as lawyers and doctors and actors, and everything that human beings do, including members of government. And when asked about this at UCLA in 2016, Mr. Barghouti said that they were collaborators. And in Arab culture, that is one of the most horrible things that you can call a person. It's a sign of the utmost betrayal for the crime of desiring coexistence.
He also made the point there that there's something like more than 60 discriminatory laws that discriminate against Palestinians. That's not just him saying that. In fact, Human Rights Watch put out a report almost 10 years ago which listed these laws as well.
Well, Human Rights Watch has a long history of inaccuracy and has been proven wrong over and over again. I can tell you, as an attorney and as an Israeli, based on Israeli law and the rules of the Israeli Supreme Court, there is literally no law in Israel that distinguishes anyone on the basis of religion. The only law that distinguishes on religion is that a Jew living outside of Israel has the right to come home to the Jewish homeland where Jews have lived for thousands of years uninterrupted and to get citizenship. But ironically, that is a right that applies only to Jews who have not yet become Israeli citizens. Once a person becomes an Israeli citizen, there is no law that distinguishes between men and women, between Jews, Muslims, Christians, Palestinians, Arabs, or any of the other people who are a part of Israel's diverse and integrated population.
Daniel, Israel's government has warned that the BDS movement is a threat, a strategic threat to Israel. But it also says that the BDS movement has had no impact at all. So which is it?
Well, as a strategic threat, I would say that BDS is not much of a threat. If it really were, you wouldn't be able to use your computer or your cell phone. You wouldn't be able to access much of the clean drinking water on Earth or many of the medications that you use. These are the kinds of exports that Israel creates. But what BDS has succeeded in doing is inspiring people who, claiming to act for BDS, have attacked Jewish-owned stores, not Israeli, Jewish-owned stores throughout the world. Just in the last 2 weeks, there was an attack in Boston, another in Miami, another in Poland. These are the violent attacks against Jewish stores that are inspired by BDS. Another area where BDS has succeeded is Israeli factories that employ Palestinians and Jews working together for the same wages, under the same conditions, and not just an economic benefit, but it's an example of coexistence that rivals anything in any other modern Western liberal democracy. A great example is SodaStream. BDS pressured them to move their factory, which costed hundreds of Palestinians their jobs, and also costed hundreds of Palestinians and Israelis the opportunity to coexist and work toward a better future. Now, Mr. Barghouti comes from the Barghouti family, one of the most wealthy and powerful families in the Palestinian territories. And a bunch of Palestinians working in a factory may not matter much for him, but my question is, who's looking out for those Palestinians? Who's speaking up for them? And most of all, who's speaking to our young people in America, in North America, in Europe, people who do care about social justice, people who are being lied to about the nature of this movement? You know, one thing Mr. Barghouti didn't mention is that just last Saturday, the New York Times revealed that the National Committee for BDS includes Hamas and the Palestinian Islamic Jihad organization, both terror groups that are on the same international lists as ISIS. BDS is an organization that is actually literally run by actual literal terror organizations with the stated purpose, in Mr. Barghouti and other BDS leaders' own words, of destroying a Jewish state in any borders. Our young people need to know this. And that's what really troubles me, because young people care about social justice, and they also care about accuracy and about not being lied to.
Right, Daniel, one other issue, and that is the BDS movement has been labeled anti-Semitic by those who oppose it. But others would say, of course, that this is free speech. So how can one be critical of Israel and Israel's policies without being labeled anti-Semitic?
Well, if you're critical of Israel and Israel's policies, you have something in common with just about every person in Israel. We have a joke that we have 9 million prime ministers because everybody thinks they're right. And I'll tell you, the level of politeness that we see in some other countries, in Israel it can be a little more forward, which is sometimes a good thing. But I'll tell you what, in the world there are 57 Muslim states. There are over 100 Christian states. There are 6 Buddhist states. There's only one Jewish country. It's one of the smaller countries in the world, with a size less than New Jersey and a population less than New York City, and it is the only one that is singled out by BDS, not for criticism, but for total destruction. Now, I'm not saying that singling out the world's only Jewish state for total destruction is anti-Semitic, but I can't imagine what else it would be.
Daniel, one final point, and we've just got a little bit of time for this. When we see images of Palestinians being killed or wounded at the Gaza border, of bulldozers destroying Palestinian homes or explosives being used to destroy Palestinian homes, is Israel not concerned that this could attract support for BDS?
Well, Israel is concerned about saving human life, both Israeli life and Palestinian life. So, for example, when we see protests at the Gaza border, but the majority of those protesters are members of Hamas, an international terror group, and some of them are firing machine guns at the Israeli army, it puts Israel in a terribly difficult position. If Israel fires back, innocent civilians could end up in the line of fire. If Israel doesn't fire back, Israeli communities could end up under fire. It's a terribly difficult situation that terror groups create that puts Israelis and Palestinians alike in terrible danger, and it's a tragedy.
Daniel Pomerantz, thanks for being with us.